Welcome to the Podcast. I'm Andy Nelson. Hey, everybody.
Oh, hi, I'm Pete Wright, and we are the co-founders of True Story FM, and we decided that we podcast a lot.
It is a lot.
You might say an exhaustive amount of podcasting that we do between all our shows, but one of the things that we don't ever get a chance to really do is to talk about the business of podcasting. And podcasting is changing a lot right now, and it's in the news, and we thought it might be interesting to have a conversation. I don't know how often we're going to have this conversation, but at least to have a conversation about what's up with the podcasting business as the news comes about.
The podcasting industry, I think it's fair to say, has changed very rapidly, very frequently since it started in the aughts, and especially recently, like really recently, like just constant changes, and it's been growing like crazy. COVID really kicked that up, and here we are. We figured, let's dig in, and this is a good place to just kind of see what's going on now. Like, what is actually happening out there at this very moment?
I think we should talk about directories first. What do you think about that?
In the scope of podcast directories, there are a variety of different apps and everything. It's probably good to discuss them because there's a lot of change going on there, right?
Yeah, there really is. I think, when we talk about what a directory is, a lot of people, I think, this is really for my mom. Okay. So mom,
hey, Mom.
A podcast directory is the place. It's the app that you use or the tool that you use to find the podcasts that you want to listen to. And the biggest ones on the market are, Apple Podcasts on Apple platforms. And Spotify obviously made some significant moves into becoming a podcast directory. There are other podcast directories. There are a lot of them. And one of the things that we've seen just literally right now is consolidation in podcast directory space that is making it, forcing listeners to change their behavior. And I think that's one of the things that I'm most interested in. How do these changes in the business landscape impact the people who just want to put their headphones on a train and listen to their latest podcasts? So, the first one that hit us, because, a True Story, we try to represent in all of the podcast directories, as many as we can find, is Radio Public. And Radio Public started as a sort of not a crowd-funded, but it was on like Republic, that investor-funded Kickstarter thing a long time ago, I think in the teens. And it was acquired by Acast, the podcast host, in 2021. Within a year of that acquisition, I think people who were on the Radio Public platform had already started reporting that this thing is just going dark. It's not looking great. But they kept their directory up and running, and they had a nice little app that people could listen to their shows on. Well, they announced that just last month that it is finally being sunset in March of 2024. And so we went through and we changed all of our landing pages and removed the Radio Public button, which is very sad because they were doing something different. They were trying to represent a place that is different in the podcasting landscape than the one that is dominated by Apple and Spotify. So that was the first one. I shed a tear personally because I think those people were really good at what they do, and it just didn't work out. So that's the first one.
Is that the end of Acast also, or is Acast still around? Yeah, Acast is still doing its publishing, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, Acast, insofar as Radio Public was a destination for like pod sites and really a way to help you fund and grow your podcast, Acast is taking that on. But Acast really is a host, right? Acast is a tool that we would use to actually where our files live, right? They didn't have as much of the app front end, as Radio Public did. It was nice. It was nice.
Yeah, right. Are they working still with Amazon quite a bit? I think they are, right?
Yes, and they're working with a lot of different people. They're also working heavily with Patreon. They're the back-end podcast support for Patreon. If you choose to do a Patreon podcast, you have a choice of either uploading your episodes as as an individual post or connecting your Acast feed into your Patreon account. So if you're looking to fund your podcast, Acast is your player.
Gotcha.
As well. So that's Radio Public. Again, consolidation. The next one is Stitcher. Stitcher was kind of a big one because they've been around forever.
It was one where a lot of people got started when they were first listening to podcasts. I remember, I think it may have been the first place I was listening to them after Apple.
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair. Stitcher, I look at, I don't know why. I don't know if this is necessarily a fair comparison, but in my head, Stitcher was the LinkedIn of podcast directories. I don't know why. It just has a very LinkedIn vibe. And so it's been around a long, long time. It was the company, Stitcher, was acquired by SiriusXM. SiriusXM is part of a massive entertainment delivery conglomerate. And they also acquired our former podcast host, Simplecast. And Simplecast has sort of absorbed the Stitcher front end. So if you want to put your podcast on Stitcher/SiriusXM, you have to go through Simplecast now. And what they're saying is, SiriusXM, that all of the podcasts that you listen to in Stitcher, once everybody goes in and claims all their podcasts, eventually they'll all be represented in the SiriusXM app experience. What I have heard from listeners is it's still very confused right now, that SiriusXM is really trying to get all their ducks in a row. Those ducks are decidedly not rowed right now, and so it makes it hard to kind of understand if SiriusXM is going to be your future destination for free and open podcasting.
Interesting. And there's a lot of like Stitcher, Earwolf, SiriusXM. That's a lot of the comedy shows that I'm familiar with, like that Earwolf would have, like Comedy Bang Bang, and Conan's there. And although maybe the two that I can remember.
Well, I in terms of when you start bringing up specific properties, this is another bit of big news. I'll just jump ahead a little bit. That for years, the Smartless podcast with Will Arnett and Jason Bateman and Sean Hayes was on Wondery, which was an Amazon company, right? Wondery Plus, which actually came out of 20th Century Fox and then was acquired by Amazon. And they had a massive deal with the Smartless guys. And so they've been exclusive with Wondery. And the reason I subscribed to Wondery Plus is so that I could get the ad-free week early version of Smartless. I'm a fan of that show legitimately. So I am deeply disappointed to hear that Wondery didn't pony up for those guys and let Smartless go to, I don't even need a drum roll, SiriusXM for $100 million, right? $100 million, Andy. God, I'm swallowing my own tongue.
Crazy.
It's too much money. So I think that is a really interesting thing that we're seeing this massive podcast buyout in an era when we're seeing massive podcast buyouts phase out, right? Like we're at the end of a certain era in podcasting, and that is representative of an interesting one. So also representative of the fact that Sirius is trying to get their house in order and have some big names that are front and center on this thing. So I think that is an interesting move.
It is. Yeah, it definitely is. What else? What other directories?
Well, I want to jump back to Google Podcasts because that's another one. That is like when you think about the big names in big tech, right? It's Spotify, Apple, and Google, which has always had the most clumsy approach to podcasting of all of them, right? It has been kind of a nightmare. They let their algorithm run rampant over podcasts. They're constantly like searching for. So as a podcaster, I have to submit our feeds to Google Podcasts and then wait. And eventually the algorithm says, okay, yes, this is really a podcast. And if you do anything on your RSS feed to change it, then the Google Podcast will say, no, we've found a different podcast. We're changing your feed. We're changing your, we're just doing things. We're doing stuff. And there are no people. Google Podcast is the iRobot of podcast directories. It is trying to be way too smart for its own good, which is kind of why I'm excited for this change. Google Podcast is going away completely. But where would a company like Google put their audio media? Where would they possibly, what platform would Google have I wonder
Let's think. Who do they own?
who else do they own that has an incredible platform for podcast audio? Oh my God! Yes, it's YouTube, and so I'm actually really excited about this. But it's a big ask. The migration to YouTube from a podcaster perspective is on par with as clumsy as the Google Podcast experience was. I've been complaining about it for weeks to you.
Alphabet.
Like,
You could say it's just a big alphabet soup.
You might say that. I see what you did. I acknowledge your reference. It was well done. So as a podcaster, you have to go into YouTube. You create essentially a podcast playlist. All of these are just glorified playlists. And then you set your RSS feed to upload the audio. And what it does is, obviously, YouTube is a video platform. So what does it do? Well, it just takes your art and creates a video that is your art shaped and processes your audio and then allows you to release it to the public. And it is subject to all of the other copyright claim systems, content ID, all the stuff that we're used to as creators from the perspective of being on YouTube. But if you upload videos, all of that now applies to your podcast. We're not accustomed to that because none of the other directories really do it, right? Podcasting has been kind of Wild West. YouTube has a system.
Well, and that's always been one of the sticking points with some of our movie-specific podcasts, because even if you put a trailer in there, you'll get dinged sometimes by YouTube saying, oh, copywritten content, even though it's a trailer, which is an advertisement, and all we are is basically using it as an advertisement for a conversation about that property. So it really should be no more than that. But, YouTube, has always dinged us in that field, and now they will continue to do so just as efficiently as they always have.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I mean, what a great example. Because one of the shows that we are proud to partner with is The Exorcist Minute. We are the production partner of The Exorcist Minute. Those guys are fantastic. They have a great show. If you're into The Exorcist, check it out. And during the writer's strike, they did a whole series of shows on the history of the devil, and it's great. And you learn a lot, and they're funny. And they used a bit of public domain classical music that is, again, operative term, public domain. And that one track on all of these 15 episodes that they did during the strike has the copyright blocked in one country. Do you know what country that is?
What? Well, okay, first, tell people what the piece of music is, because maybe that will clue them in.
Oh, no.
It's a Night on Bald Mountain.
Night on Bald Mountain.
Mazursky,
it is Night on Bald Mountain. Yes, Mazursky. So the country, Andy, is Russia.
Yes.
Russia has blocked our podcast episodes. No one can listen to this in Russia. And I don't know why I find that so funny. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it is funny. There's no acknowledgement of the public domain in Russia. And
you want Mazursky, you pay for it.
You pay for it, right? So that's where we are. YouTube. So this was the other issue with YouTube. Normally, when you publish an RSS feed, right? This is the backbone of podcasting. When you publish it to a directory, the directory says, okay, I see the RSS feed, I acknowledge it, and I will serve it. And that means when a user, we'll call her Natalie, opens up her podcast app and says, I want to subscribe to this podcast, the directory is merely a pass-through agent. The directory just says, okay, Natalie, hey, I want to introduce you to the True Story guys, and you guys are really great together. And so we're just going to have you listen to their stuff. And that's it. We take on the responsibility of making sure that our feeds are up to date, that all of our episodes are in place. That's not how YouTube works. YouTube actually takes our audio and uploads it to their own services in order to create the video versions. Yeah. But that means we are no longer hosting our own audio for YouTube. They are. We can still go in and change all the goodies, but that means that this migration to YouTube is comically slow because we can only upload 100 episodes a day, and we have thousands and thousands and thousands of episodes in our catalog over the last since 2006. And so it has been an absolute circus getting into YouTube. I am confident that once we do, I'm already seeing some massive spikes in listenership as Google Podcast listeners find our shows in YouTube and YouTube Music and are able to subscribe to them. And that is a fantastic thing. But our bigger shows are taking forever. And I think we're seeing that across the industry as people update their audio editions of their podcasts into YouTube Music. So I'm not sure any of this made a lot of sense, but it does. I think it will be ultimately good for us to find new listeners in this platform.
Yeah, I do too. The one thing that I'm not looking forward to that also speaks to just this whole process that YouTube is forcing upon us, no matter what directories we use, we've always been able to calculate our the numbers, like the stats, the analytics from one place. Now it's going to increase because YouTube's any views on YouTube, we have to check in on YouTube to get those stats, correct?
Yeah. On one hand, it's troublesome because now we have to do math, right? We have to actually do podcast math because none of the analytics coming through YouTube are going to go into our other analytics platforms, whether that's Chartable or Transistor, where we host our own hosting partner. On the upside, while we get all of YouTube's, the baggage of YouTube's Content ID system and all of their copyright system, we also get their analytics because they are deep into the analytics of their listeners. And we can now see the number of people who start, the number of people who subscribe to our channel, the number of people who listen to more than a certain number of minutes, right? We get to see data that we are not accustomed to. And I think what's interesting, and particularly on our shows, we do a movie show, right? The Next Reel is our movie show, and all of the titles of our podcast are first the name of the movie, right? And that has gotten us a massive spike in YouTube listens for people who I think are searching for the movie, and they find our podcast and are very disappointed, I have to imagine, because they listen to like 10 seconds. I can see they're listening to like 10 seconds of our movie show, which isn't the movie, and then they hang up. So, good math, pros and cons for sure of what we have ahead of us. So
Apple is really the only place where we can get any of that sort of analytic, right? I mean, we
get some. We get some with Spotify.
It's a little work to kind of go through Apple to kind of dig around in there, but they do provide some of that at least.
Well, it is, and I would say comparing. I'm going to say it, apples to apples isn't really possible. But in Apple, we have that subset of people who are listening. They're listening on an Apple device in an Apple app, and they are listening to our podcast. And with YouTube, of course, they'll be listening to YouTube Music, but we also have the web listens, right? And YouTube is, I should add, a fantastic sharing economy. It is possible that overnight, YouTube becomes the easiest way to share a podcast for someone to listen to immediately. So, Mom, when we do an episode and it shows up on YouTube, expect YouTube links. And I think that's fascinating.
Is this, with all of this conversation about all of these different directories, I mean, are we shifting to a place? I mean, I can't imagine we're going to be getting to a place like the networks, the TV networks with the big three or something like that. But it's not quite like cable or anything since where we've got hundreds of them. But it does seem like it's thinning out. Like as things get acquired and everything. Are we feeling like we're hitting a point where things are settling, or does it seem like there are too many small things out there that still are going to get gobbled up?
Well, I hope they don't. I really hope they don't, because the best podcast experiences are not in these big three, right? If you love podcasting, search out great podcast apps, right? Check out Overcast from Marco Arment. Check out Pocket Casts from Automatic. Like, these are really good, useful tools, and the people who are developing them are really putting their, real sweat into making sure that the audio experience is great, and I love them.
Yeah.
I say that, and out of the other side of my mouth, our analytics, Apple users and listeners are a massive have a massive, massive weight on True Story. Most people who are listening to True Story shows across the podcasts that we do are listening on Apple Podcasts in some way, shape, or form. And Spotify is creeping up, but it is still a shadow in what, because Apple is the default on podcast listeners' devices, and those are generally iPhones, iPads. So that's where we are. Is there consolidation? I don't know. I'm really curious. I don't want to make any bets on the role of YouTube Music in podcasting space for 2024 because I think it's all up in the air. But
Truly.
I'm optimistic. I'm really optimistic. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so shifting gears. So that's podcast directories. That's a big thing going on. We've already talked a little bit about Smartless. I brought that up with that change. Anything else going on with other podcast show changes? Any other big things that are worth note?
I don't know. I mean, this is just something I've been thinking about. You can tell me if you think I'm crazy. What I hinted at earlier was the end of this epoch of massive podcast spending.
Yeah.
And that's because, right around 2019, 2020, 2021, we're talking about pandemic era, there was a lot of money being put into podcasting. And this was the era of, Gimlet shows and NPR heavily investing and lots of investor money going into acquisitions and trying to consolidate creator networks. And these people who started out with field recorders and, boom mics walking around the street suddenly had a ton of money and hired lots of teams of incredibly creative audio professionals, and they created great shows. But all of the money inflated the entire business. The entire business built on the backs of people who don't know what an editorial calendar is. They just like to create stuff. Right? Yeah. And I think those two parts of the business collided. And 2023 and now 24, we're seeing a reset. Like, I'm seeing so much news about the podcast industry is losing luster. I don't think that's true. I think the podcast bubble has burst. And we're seeing a reset and rediscovering the creators who have been here all along, just trying to create good stuff. So Joe Rogan, for example, went to Spotify exclusive in 2020, and just a week ago or something, as we're recording this, very, very recently, Spotify renegotiated his deal, or he renegotiated his deal with Spotify, and they got rid of the exclusivity clause. So now Joe Rogan, for the first time in 4 years, is back in Apple Podcasts and eventually YouTube Podcasts, I'm sure, or YouTube Music, I'm sure, and in all of the places where you can get podcasts. And to me, I look at that as a sign that podcasting, in order to thrive, requires a degree of openness that all of those, heavily financially inflated deals ignored. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's great news that we're seeing that kind of thing. Do you think I'm crazy?
Well, no, but I still think it's crazy that, and I'm not exactly sure Spotify's mindset, but the exclusive licensing deal in September 2020 was about $200 million. This latest one, February 2024, it's $250 million and it's non-exclusive. And so I'm not exactly sure. I don't think inflation works quite that steeply over 4 years. Maybe I'm wrong. But
it's podflation.
Podflation.
I think you're.
It's Roganflation is what it is.
It's Roganflation. I think there's something to that, though, right? This is because for them, it's not just the exclusivity deal; it's the advertising deal. Because now they're paying, a portion of that has to be allocated to the fact that they're going to have a massive new audience. That's what the exclusivity deal turned off, was the ability for people who don't use Spotify and don't care about Spotify, who left Rogan, to even hear all the Spotify stuff, right? I think it's interesting now to have him back in Apple Podcasts, where I'm sure the audience will grow quickly and they will all be hearing and be constantly reminded about the value of Spotify because he will pitch it. That's where the ads are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I am curious if, there was so much controversy with him regarding misinformation and stuff like that. And I wonder how that's going to play out outside of the Spotify circles, because I know Spotify had its own
right?
Non-reactions with that.
Well, and thank God Neil Young was there, because you remember that was the big deal, where Neil Young pulled all his music off of Spotify.
Yeah,
What's he going to pull all his music off of Apple Music too?
Knowing Neil Young.
Neil Young,
yes.
probably.
Yeah,
right. I'm sure he's already done it. So that, I don't know. I don't have a checklist of all the other shows that are, out there, but that have exclusivity deals. But I do. I mean, I think it's important to talk about some of the other shifts that have happened in the industry of late.
Yeah, I mean, we've encountered this quite a bit with advertising and the shifting attitude toward the dynamically inserted ads, because they're just don't relate. They feel, listeners feel like they're having kind of this intimate conversation, or, they're listening to an intimate conversation with somebody who feels like their friend. And then suddenly you get this ad for a casino or something thrust at you. And that's been kind of something that a lot of podcasts have started listening to, that these dynamically inserted ads don't seem like they're working as well. And so, listeners have, people are starting to listen more to the listeners, I suppose, is a good way to phrase the next part of our conversation here. Yeah,
I hope so. And when you look at the, we're talking about all the noise around the shifting habits of podcasts, and all the podcasts that were canceled in 2023 that probably would have been fine had they gone toward a listener model. Their audiences were big enough that just law of large numbers might have actually supported their production. Heavyweight, Rough Translation, Louder Than a Riot, or Into It from Sam Sanders. Like, these podcasts were beloved. And because they were part of Spotify or NPR, they were just axed. And I cannot help but look at those as somebody who's in the podcast business and think, my God, those were treasures, those shows. And putting them on a member support model, I just have to imagine would have helped them to thrive at a smaller scale. It doesn't take much to help a podcast thrive, at scale.
Yeah. It's not, we're not producing TV shows with,
right.
On location and all these, big actor salaries, things like that. It's a very different model. And so, I don't know, just working with the listeners in a way that helps the listeners better understand. I mean, if you're going to, ads that are recorded by the podcasters, but then as you're talking about, like this listener supported model of membership-based podcasting and using that to kind of help keep your shows growing with the audiences that are dedicated to you.
Yeah. I think that has been a big lesson learned, which is that, in the face of all of the big money buyouts and inflation that we've been talking about, all those inflated ad rates, as the podcast bubble continues to ooze, pop, it is the value of listener support.
If it's oozing.
It is so gross. It is that listener support that helps to completely soften the dramatic, sharp curves that happen when advertisers pull out for whatever reason or another. So I guess my call to action is, like, please, if there is a podcast that you find you love and there is a way to support it directly, please do it. Right? There is just no way to understate the value of modest paying audiences for creators looking to thrive and create more. And that is I know for that can be a hard ask, but it really, again, is just if there is a small portion of any podcast audience that is willing to throw a few bucks a month at the show, it can help shows really take off. And I hope that becomes the story of 24, 25, 26 is more creator control thanks to listener direct involvement.
I mean, I think it's a valuable way to really kind of not just grow your support and you have your listeners, but you're also building this community. And I think that's something that really that people really enjoy.
Me too.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is going to be really fun, and we'll figure it out. We'll figure out a schedule, and this show will come out some more. But hang out with us. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for being a part of it. And, if this is your first True Story show, head over to truestory.fm and see what other shows we have on the table, all in entertainment and social good and comedy and feelings. We're thrilled to have you here and have you on board. And if this is the only True Story show you ever listen to, well, we appreciate you there too.
Hope you enjoy it. See you next time.